What would you do if love and blood pulled you in opposite directions? Today's story will touch your heart. A grandmother arrives to see her granddaughter, Nee, after months apart. But when she meets Diep and James, the couple who've been caring for the child, something begins to change in her heart. Will she take Nye back, or will she make the hardest decision a grandmother can? Stay until the end. The answer might break your heart and heal it at the same time. If this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next emotional chapter of Diep and James's journey. The wooden gate creaked open, and Nee's grandmother slowly stepped inside. Her eyes swept across the small yard where the sound of laughter had once lingered. This was her first time here, her first time truly seeing where her granddaughter had been living. The humble home glowed faintly in the afternoon light. James and Diep were inside, their voices gentle, weaving through the soft rhythm of daily chores. When Diep turned around and saw the elderly woman at the doorway, she quickly put down the bowl she was washing and came out. "Oh, Grandma, please come in." Her tone was warm but careful, uncertain how to act around the woman who was, by blood, Nee's family. James stepped forward, pulling out a chair. "Please sit down," he said politely, then poured her a glass of water. "It's hot today." The old woman nodded, her expression unreadable. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the glass. "Thank you." She paused, eyes wandering around the modest space. Simple walls, neatly folded clothes, a child's drawing taped near the window. "I've been watching for a few days," she began quietly, "and I can see you both truly love Nye." Her words were calm, but the air grew heavy with meaning. Diep hesitated, then smiled softly. "We do. She's become a part of our life, our little heartbeat in this home." The grandmother sighed, her voice fragile but sincere. "Before, I was so busy trying to survive, I didn't give her the care she deserved. And now, I see her laughing again, eating well, studying with joy. You've given her something I couldn't. Peace." Diep's eyes welled up. She's such a good girl. Every day, she teaches us something about kindness. James, standing quietly nearby, finally spoke. "Grandma, we never wanted to take her from you. We just wanted her to heal, to have a home where she could smile again." The grandmother looked at him for a long moment, her gaze gentle, measuring. Then in a low voice, she said, "I know, and that's why I came here today. I've made my decision." Diep's breath caught in her throat. "I want Nee to stay here, with you two," the grandmother said. "You've cared for her, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. That kind of love matters." The words hung in the air, trembling with emotion. Diep pressed her palms to her lips as tears spilled over. "Thank you. Truly. We promised to raise her well." James nodded, his voice thick. "You can visit anytime you want. And when summer comes, if you'd like, she can spend a few weeks with you." The old woman smiled faintly. "That's kind of you. I just want her to grow up happy." For a few seconds, no one spoke. The tension melted into something pure. Acceptance. Diep reached out gently. "Please, stay for dinner tonight. It would mean a lot to us." The grandmother hesitated. "Oh, I don't want to trouble you." "You're not," Diep interrupted softly. "It's an honor." James stood up and grabbed his wallet. "I'll run to the market and get some fresh vegetables and fish. We'll cook something nice." As he left, The grandmother's eyes followed him. "He's a good man," she murmured. Diep smiled, watching him go. "He really is. He treats Nye like his own." The two women sat together for the first time, unsure at first, but slowly easing into quiet conversation. They talked about Nye, how she used to be shy around new people, how she'd recently learned to draw little flowers and suns. The grandmother listened closely, her eyes glistening as she realized how much she'd missed in her granddaughter's life. "I used to think," the old woman said softly, "that blood was everything, that no one could love her the way I do. But I was wrong." Diep's voice was tender. "Blood connects us, but love keeps us together." The grandmother looked around the room again. The clean floors, the scent of rice cooking, the soft hum of life in every corner. "This house is small," she said, "but it feels full. She's lucky." Diep smiled faintly. "No," she whispered. "We're lucky to have her." They both sat in silence for a while, the moment thick with emotion. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, carrying the smell of rain. The grandmother's mind drifted through years of worry and regret. She had lost so much time, so many chances. But as she looked at Diep, this young woman who had stepped up when no one else did, she felt her heart lighten. "Thank you," she said suddenly, "for everything you've done for my granddaughter." Diep shook her head. "There's no need to thank us. She's part of us now." By the time James returned, carrying a basket full of groceries, laughter had quietly filled the small house again. Diep began cooking, while the grandmother helped wash vegetables, her old hands moving slowly but surely. James set the table, occasionally glancing at the two women sharing soft smiles. As the aroma of stew and rice spread through the home, the air felt warmer, gentler. Outside, dusk fell quietly. Inside, three lives, once strangers, were weaving themselves into something that felt like family. When they finally sat down to eat, the grandmother raised her bowl slightly. "To Nye," she said. Diep added softly, "To family." James smiled, completing the circle. "To love, the kind that chooses, not the kind that's born." The clink of their bowls echoed softly in the small kitchen, sealing a new beginning. Dinner carried on quietly, the sound of clinking bowls mixing with soft laughter. The small wooden table seemed to hold more than food. It carried years of pain slowly turning into peace. Diep glanced toward the small bed where Nye slept soundly, a faint smile on her lips. "She sleeps better now," Diep said softly. "No more crying at night." The grandmother nodded, eyes moist. "Before, she used to cling to me every night. I thought it was just her being spoiled. I didn't know it was loneliness." James refilled her teacup. "Sometimes kids don't need much, just love that stays." The old woman looked at him, her heart tightening. Here was a man with no blood tie to Nye, yet every word he spoke was full of care. After dinner, Diep began to clean up, but the grandmother stopped her. "Let me help," she said. "It feels good to do something for her, even a small thing." They stood side by side, washing dishes under the dim light. The clinking water and soft conversation filled the room with warmth. Though they had only met today, it felt like they had known each other for years. When the dishes were done, they stepped outside. The night had fallen softly, crickets chirping, a cool breeze brushing past. The grandmother sat on the old bench. "After my daughter passed away," she began quietly, I promised I'd raise Nye well, but I was too busy surviving. I thought food and a roof were enough. I didn't see what she really needed. Diep sat beside her. You did your best. We all do what we can with what we have. The grandmother looked at her. And you? What made you take in a child that's not your own? Diep paused, eyes gentle. Because I knew what it felt like to be alone, and I didn't want Nye to feel that way again. A long silence settled, broken only by the sound of the wind. Then the old woman smiled faintly. You have a good heart. Maybe this was meant to be. She reached into her small cloth bag and took out an old silver hairpin. This belonged to Nye's mother, she said, placing it in Diep's hands. Keep it. Let it remind you of the love that brought us here. Diep's hands trembled. I can't accept something so precious. It belongs where love lives, the grandmother said softly. And that's with you. Tears slipped down Diep's cheeks. Thank you. I'll keep it safe. For Nye. The grandmother smiled, her eyes finally at peace. She's happy here. That's all a mother or grandmother could ask for. James stepped outside, leaning on the door frame. We'll make sure she always remembers her family, every part of it. The grandmother nodded. Tell her stories. Don't let her forget where she came from. A breeze swept through the yard, carrying the scent of jasmine and earth after rain. The grandmother looked up at the stars. You know, she whispered, I thought blood was everything, but maybe love is stronger. Diep smiled faintly. Love builds what blood can't. When it was time for her to leave, Diep walked her to the gate. Please, stay the night, she offered. The grandmother shook her head. No, dear. I've already stayed long enough. My heart's light now. I can rest easy, knowing she's loved. James carried her small travel bag. We'll bring Nye to visit you this weekend. The grandmother took their hands in hers. Thank you for loving her when I couldn't. You've turned her world into something bright again. Her voice broke slightly, but her eyes glowed with quiet pride. Diep squeezed her hand. Family isn't always born. Sometimes it's built. The grandmother nodded, tears shimmering. Yes, and love, once it starts, never leaves. As she walked away, her figure faded slowly into the misty night. For the first time in years, her steps were steady. Inside, Diep leaned into James, eyes wet. Do you think we're ready to be parents for real? He smiled, brushing her hair gently. We already are. We became parents the day she called you Mom. Outside, the rain began to fall again, soft and light. Diep looked at the silver hairpin in her hand, its surface reflecting the dim light of their small home. In that simple glimmer, she saw everything. Nye's laughter, the grandmother's forgiveness, the love that had quietly stitched them all together. She whispered, we'll give her everything. Love, safety, a future. The rain grew steadier, washing the dust from the yard, cleansing old wounds. Inside, the three hearts that fate had once scattered were now bound together by love, not blood. And under that soft rain, a new chapter began. Quiet, gentle, and everlasting.
When your grandmother visits Diep and James, she expects to find distance, but instead discover warmth. In Diep and James' modest home, she sees laughter, comfort, and the love her granddaughter had long been missing. Over a simple dinner, trust and forgiveness replace silence. Moved by this sincerity, the grandmother decided to let Nye stay with them, trusting that love, not blood, would raise her best. Before leaving, she gave Diep a silver hairpin, her daughter keepsake, and a symbol of acceptance and new beginning. As rain softly fallen, the old woman walked away in peace, knowing ye finally home. This touching story reminds us that family isn't defined by who we born to, but by who stays, loves, and chooses us, even when life gives no reason to. Thanks for watching.